March 2007. Detroit, Michigan. Carpenter. Jake Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead as he surveyed the abandoned warehouse on Corktown's Jefferson Avenue. The city had contracted his renovation compa. What should have been routine measurements and foundation checks was about to become something far more significant. "This place hasn't been touched in decades," Jake muttered to his assistant, Tommy Chen, as they navigated through debris and broken glass. The warehouse had stood empty since the early 1990s, a victim of Detroit's industrial decline. Jake was 42, built solid from 20 years of construction work. His weathered hands knew how to read buildings like books, understanding their history through cracks in walls and patterns of decay. He had grown up in Detroit, watched the city's transformation from prosperity to struggle, and had chosen to stay when others fled to the suburbs. The warehouse stretched nearly a full city block, its high ceilings supported by massive steel beams that had once held automotive parts destined for assembly lines. Now it held only shadows, dust, and the accumulated debris of abandonment. "Check the back corner," Jake called to Tommy. "I want to know if that support wall is load-bearing." "Yo." Tommy disappeared into the darkness while Jake examined the main floor's concrete foundation. The building was structurally sound despite years of neglect. Someone had built it to last. "Jake?" Tommy's voice echoed from the rear of the warehouse. "You need to see this." Jake grabbed his flashlight and made his way through the maze of fallen beams and scattered brick. Tommy stood frozen beside what appeared to be a makeshift living space hidden behind a wall of stacked crates. The area was roughly 12 feet square, enclosed on three sides by towering boxes that had once contained industrial equipment. Someone had lived here. A sleeping bag lay crumpled in the corner. Empty food cans were scattered across the floor. But what made both men stop breathing was the pile of clothing folded neatly on a wooden crate that served as a table. "Is that what I think it is?" Tommy whispered. Jake approached carefully, his flashlight beam revealing the unmistakable yellow and black stripes of Detroit Fire Department gear. The jacket was faded and stained, but the reflective strips still caught the light. DFD was embroidered clearly on the back. "Don't touch anything," Jake said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. He had heard stories from old-timers in the neighborhood, stories about firefighters who had disappeared during the city's most chaotic years. The gear was old, probably from the late 1980s or early 1990s, based on the style and condition. The fabric was worn but not rotted, suggesting it had been protected from the elements. The helmet lay beside the jacket, its number partially visible. 47. "Should we call someone?" Tommy asked. Jake was already reaching for his cell phone. He had lived in Detroit long enough to know that abandoned fire gear didn't end up in warehouses by accident. Someone had brought it here. Someone had lived here. And someone had left in a hurry. The police arrived within 30 minutes. Detective Maria Santos, a 15-year veteran of Detroit PD, examined the scene with careful attention to detail. She was in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had seen enough to remain skeptical of easy explanations. "When was the last time anyone was in this building?" Detective Santos asked Jake. "According to city records, it's been empty since 1992, Jake replied. "The previous owner went bankrupt. City took it for unpaid taxes in 1995. Detective Santos photographed everything before touching anything. The sleeping bag, the food containers, the carefully folded uniform. She had worked missing persons cases before, and something about this discovery felt significant. "The gear is from the early 1990s, she noted, examining the helmet more closely. "Unit 47. I'll need to cross-reference this with missing firefighter reports from that period." She bagged each item separately, following proper evidence collection procedures. The jacket yielded the most information. A name tag reading T. Walsh was still clearly visible on the chest. "Thomas Walsh," Detective Santos said, more to herself than to Jake and Tommy. "I'll run this name through our databases." As the detective continued her work, Jake found himself studying the makeshift living space more carefully. Someone had survived here for an extended period. The food cans suggested months, maybe longer. But why would a firefighter hide in an abandoned warehouse? Was there any sign of forced entry? Detective Santos asked, Jake shook his head. All the doors were still locked when we arrived. We had to cut the chain on the main entrance. But there's a loading dock in the back where someone could have gotten in if they knew where to look. The detective made notes. I'll need you both to come to the station tomorrow to give formal statements. This could be related to a missing person case. That evening, Jake couldn't shake the image of the neatly folded uniform. Someone had cared enough to preserve it, to keep it clean and organized even while living in desperate conditions. The discovery felt like a message from the past, a plea for help that had taken 17 years to be heard. Detective Santos returned to the precinct and immediately began searching through missing person files from the early 1990s. The computer system was relatively new, but many older cases had been digitized. She started with Firefighter Thomas Walsh and Unit 47. The search yielded results within minutes. Thomas Walsh, age 31, Detroit Fire Department Engine Company 47, reported missing October 15, 1990. Never found. Case remained open, but inactive. Detective Santos pulled the physical file from storage. Thomas Walsh had been a respected firefighter with 7 years of service. Married to Patricia Walsh, father of 2 young children. He had left for his shift on October 15, 1990, and never returned home. His fellow firefighters reported that he had responded to a routine call that evening, but had become separated from his crew during the response. The official report stated that Walsh had last been seen entering a burning building on Detroit's east side. When the fire was extinguished and the building searched, no trace of him was found. The assumption had been that he perished in the blaze, but no body was ever recovered. Now, 17 years later, his gear had surfaced in a warehouse miles from that original fire scene. Detective Santos reached for her phone to call Patricia Walsh, knowing that a call she had hoped never to receive was about to change a family's life once again. The original investigation. The next morning, Detective Santos sat across from Patricia Walsh in the modest Dearborn home where she had raised her 2 children alone for the past 17 years. Patricia was now 48, her brown hair streaked with gray, but her eyes still showed the sharp intelligence that had attracted Thomas Walsh 25 years earlier. "I never believed he died in that fire," Patricia said quietly, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had grown cold during their conversation. "Tom was too careful, too experienced. He always said fires were predictable if you understood them." Detective Santos had brought copies of the evidence photos from the warehouse, though she had held back the more disturbing details of the discovery. "Mrs. Walsh, can you positively identify this gear as belonging to your husband?" Patricia examined the photographs carefully. "The jacket, yes." Tom was particular about keeping his gear clean, and he had a small tear in the left pocket that he never bothered to repair. "It's visible in this photo." She pointed to a barely noticeable imperfection in the fabric. "Tell me about the night he disappeared." Patricia had told this story many times over the years, first to police, then to reporters, eventually to her children when they were old enough to understand. But she had never stopped hoping that someday new information would emerge. October 15, 1990. Tom left for his shift at 6 p.m. He called me around 9 to say they had a routine warehouse fire on Gratiot Avenue. Said he'd be home by midnight. Patricia's voice remained steady, but Detective Santos noticed how tightly she gripped the mug. He never called again. When his captain called me at 2 a.m., I knew something was wrong. Tom always called if he was going to be late. Detective Santos consulted the original case file. Fire Captain Robert Mitchell had filed the initial missing person report. Mitchell was now retired, but Santos had scheduled an interview with him for that afternoon. "Mrs. Walsh, during the original investigation, did anyone suggest that your husband might have left voluntarily?" Patricia's jaw tightened. "Some people whispered about it, said maybe Tom couldn't handle the pressure of family life, of the job. But they didn't know him. Tom loved his children more than anything. He was planning to take them camping that weekend. The original investigation had been thorough but limited by the technology of 1990. No cell phone records to analyze, no security cameras to review, no GPS tracking. Investigators had relied on witness statements and physical evidence, both of which had been scarce. Did your husband have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm him? Tom was liked by everyone. Even the guys he'd had disagreements with respected him. He was fair, honest, maybe too honest sometimes. Patricia paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. There was one thing that always bothered me. Detective Santos leaned forward. 3 weeks before he disappeared, Tom came home upset about something that had happened at work. He wouldn't tell me details, said it was department business, but he kept saying that some people in positions of authority couldn't be trusted. This was new information. Detective Santos checked the original file but found no mention of workplace conflicts or concerns. Did he give you any specifics? Names? Incidents? No. Tom was careful about that. He said the fire department was like the military. You handled problems through proper channels, but he was worried about something. I could tell. Detective Santos made careful notes. After 17 years, memories could become distorted, but Patricia Walsh struck her as someone who chose her words precisely. That afternoon, Detective Santos drove to Livonia to meet with retired fire captain Robert Mitchell. Mitchell lived in a neat ranch house with a well-maintained lawn and an American flag hanging from his front porch. He was 68 now, his hair completely white, but his handshake was still firm and his memory sharp. Tom Walsh, Mitchell said, settling into his recliner. I think about him every October 15th. Good man, good firefighter. His disappearance never made sense. Mitchell had supervised Engine Company 47 for 12 years before retiring in 2003. He had personally trained Walsh and considered him one of his most reliable firefighters. Tell me about that night, Captain. We got the call at 8:47 p.m. Warehouse fire on Gratiot near Connor. Not unusual. We were getting a lot of those in 1990. Abandoned buildings, homeless people trying to stay warm, electrical problems in old wiring. Mitchell stood and walked to a bookshelf where he retrieved a leather-bound notebook. I kept personal logs of every major incident. Here it is. He opened to October 15th, 1990. We arrived on scene at 9:03 p.m. Fire was contained to the second floor of a 3-story building. Standard approach. Walsh and Rodriguez took the interior attack. Johnson and Martinez handled the ladder truck. What happened next? Walsh and Rodriguez entered through the main entrance. Radio contact was normal for the first 15 minutes. Then Rodriguez reported that he and Walsh had become separated in heavy smoke. Rodriguez exited the building, but Walsh never came out. Detective Santos compared Mitchell's account to the official report. The details matched exactly. We searched that building 3 times that night, brought in additional crews, used thermal imaging equipment. No trace of Tom. It was like he vanished. Was there any possibility that he exited through another route? Mitchell shook his head firmly. We had men positioned at every exit. No one came out without being accounted for. And Tom was experienced enough to know proper evacuation procedures. Captain, Mrs. Walsh mentioned that her husband was concerned about something at work in the weeks before he disappeared. Do you remember anything about that? Mitchell's expression grew guarded. Tom was a conscientious firefighter. Sometimes that meant he asked questions that made people uncomfortable. What kind of questions? Response times, equipment maintenance, personnel assignments. Mitchell paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Tom had noticed some irregularities in how certain calls were handled. Nothing he could prove, but patterns that concerned him. This was the first concrete indication that Thomas Walsh might have stumbled onto something that led to his disappearance. Detective Santos pressed for details. Captain, I'm investigating new evidence in this case. If there was something irregular happening in 1990, it could be crucial to understanding what happened to Walsh. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to his window, looking out at his carefully tended garden. There were rumors in 1990, he said finally. Rumors about certain fires being allowed to burn longer than necessary, about response delays to specific addresses, about equipment failures that seemed too convenient. Are you suggesting that some fires were deliberately mishandled? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what Tom Walsh was concerned about in the weeks before he disappeared. Whether those concerns were justified, Mitchell turned back to face Detective Santos. Tom was asking questions about Fire Chief Daniel Morrison's response protocols. The name hit Detective Santos like a physical blow. Daniel Morrison had been fire chief from 1987 to 1995. He was also Jake Morrison's father, Jake being the carpenter who had discovered the gear in the warehouse. Family connections. Detective Santos drove straight from Captain Mitchell's house to Jake Morrison's construction office in Highland Park. The one-story brick building sat between an auto parts store and a vacant lot that had once held a gas station. Jake was at his desk, reviewing blueprints for a school renovation project when Detective Santos arrived. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you some additional questions about yesterday's discovery." Jake looked up from his plans. "Of course. Have you learned anything about the gear we found?" The uniform belonged to Thomas Walsh, a Detroit firefighter who disappeared in 1990. "But I need to ask you about a potential connection." Detective Santos consulted her notes. "Was your father Daniel Morrison, former fire chief of the Detroit Fire Department?" Jake's expression shifted immediately. The casual cooperation became guarded attention. "Yes, my father was Chief Morrison." "Why?" Thomas Walsh had expressed concerns about department operations in the weeks before he disappeared. "Your father's name came up in our investigation." Jake pushed back from his desk and stood. He was several inches taller than Detective Santos, and built like someone who had spent years lifting heavy materials, but his posture wasn't threatening. It was defensive. "Detective, my father retired 15 years ago. He died in 2004. Whatever concerns this Walsh guy had, I wouldn't know anything about them. I understand this is difficult, Mr. Morrison, but the timing of Walsh's concerns, followed by his disappearance, followed by the discovery of his gear in a warehouse 17 years later, these aren't coincidences." Jake walked to the window overlooking the parking lot where his work truck sat lined up like soldiers. "My father was fire chief for 8 years. He oversaw thousands of calls, managed hundreds of firefighters. If there were problems with response times or protocols, it was because the city was cutting budgets and the department was understaffed. Mr. Morrison, I'm not here to attack your father's reputation. I'm trying to understand what happened to Thomas Walsh." Jake turned back to face her. "You want to know about my father? He worked 60-hour weeks trying to keep Detroit from burning down. He came home exhausted every night, worried about his men, worried about equipment failures, worried about response times. The stress of that job killed him." Detective Santos could see the genuine pain in Jake's eyes, but she also noticed that he hadn't directly denied any wrongdoing. "Did your father ever mention Thomas Walsh?" "No. Should he have?" Walsh was investigating irregularities in fire response protocols. According to his captain, these concerns were directed specifically at your father's administration. Jake was quiet for several long moments. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "Detective, my father handled thousands of emergencies during his time as chief. If one firefighter had concerns about protocols, there were proper channels for addressing those concerns. Were those channels used?" "I wouldn't know. I was 26 in 1990, working construction in Ohio. I didn't move back to Detroit until 1995. Detective Santos made notes. Jake Morrison's defensive response was understandable given the circumstances, but it didn't provide the information she needed. "Mr. Morrison, is there anyone still alive who worked closely with your father during that period?" Jake considered the question. "Deputy Chief Frank Rodriguez might still be around. He and my father were close friends. Rodriguez helped with the funeral arrangements in 2004. The name Rodriguez triggered a memory. Detective Santos checked her notes. "Was Rodriguez the firefighter who was with Walsh the night he disappeared?" Jake's face went pale. "I don't know. Maybe. Rodriguez was a common name in the department." But Detective Santos could see in Jake's expression that he had made the same connection she had. Frank Rodriguez had been Thomas Walsh's partner the night Walsh disappeared. Frank Rodriguez had also been Daniel Morrison's closest friend and deputy. That evening, Detective Santos worked late at the precinct, cross-referencing personnel records from 1990. Frank Rodriguez had indeed been deputy chief under Daniel Morrison. He had also been the last person to see Thomas Walsh alive. Rodriguez lived in Warren, a Detroit suburb. According to city records, he had retired in 1996 with a full pension and had never been the subject of internal investigations or disciplinary actions. His personnel file described him as a dedicated public servant with commendations for bravery and leadership. Detective Santos called Rodriguez and arranged to meet him the following morning. She spent the rest of the evening studying the original case files, looking for patterns or connections that might have been missed in 1990. The warehouse fire that had claimed Thomas Walsh occurred at 1247 Gratiot Avenue. The building had been empty for 6 months before the fire. The owner was listed as Morrison Properties LLC, a real estate investment company. Detective Santos felt her pulse quicken. She ran a property search on Morrison Properties and found that it had been incorporated in 1987 with Daniel Morrison as the primary shareholder. Fire Chief Daniel Morrison had sent firefighters to battle a blaze in a building he owned. She dug deeper into the property records. Morrison Properties had owned 12 buildings in Detroit between 1987 and 1995. 8 of those buildings had suffered fires during the same period. 7 of the fires had resulted in total losses, allowing Morrison to collect insurance payments. The pattern was clear, but proving deliberate arson would be difficult after 17 years. More importantly, it suggested a motive for Thomas Walsh's disappearance. If Walsh had discovered the connection between the fires and Chief Morrison's property investments, he would have represented a serious threat to a lucrative criminal enterprise. Detective Santos called Patricia Walsh at home. "Mrs. Walsh, I need to ask you about the fire where your husband disappeared. Did Tom ever mention that the building belonged to Fire Chief Morrison?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "No, he never said that specifically, but I remember him saying something about the fire being convenient for someone. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. Did your husband ever mention keeping records or documentation of his concerns?" "Tom kept a notebook. He wrote down everything: call times, response times, equipment status. He said it was important to document everything in case there were ever questions about department performance." "Mrs. Walsh, what happened to that notebook?" "The police took it during the original investigation. I assumed it was returned to the department." Detective Santos checked the evidence inventory from 1990. Thomas Walsh's personal notebook was listed as Evidence Items SHA 247. According to the log, it had been returned to the Detroit Fire Department for administrative review. She called the fire department's administrative office, but was told that personnel records from 1990 had been moved to off-site storage. It would take several days to locate specific items. Detective Santos suspected that Thomas Walsh's notebook had contained evidence of Chief Morrison's insurance fraud scheme. She also suspected that the notebook had been deliberately destroyed to protect Morrison and his conspirators. But Thomas Walsh himself had survived the warehouse fire. He had lived in hiding for months, possibly years, in the abandoned building where Jake Morrison had found his gear. The question was, what had happened to Thomas Walsh, and why had he never tried to contact his family? The deputy's story. Frank Rodriguez lived in a well-maintained colonial house with a manicured lawn and flower beds that suggested someone who took pride in details. At 63, he was still physically imposing, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He invited Detective Santos into his living room, which was decorated with Firefighter memorabilia and family photographs. "I've been expecting this call for 17 years, Rodriguez said as he served coffee from a service that looked like it had been a retirement gift. "Ever since Tom Walsh disappeared, I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Detective Santos set down her coffee cup carefully. "Mr. Rodriguez, you were the last person to see Thomas Walsh alive." "Yes, and that's something I've had to live with every day since." Rodriguez sat heavily in his recliner. "Tom and I entered that building together on Gratiot Avenue. We were following standard procedures. Interior attack on a second-floor fire. What happened inside the building?" Rodriguez stared out his front window, but Detective Santos could see that he was looking at something 17 years in the past. The smoke was heavier than expected. Visibility was near zero. "Tom and I got separated when we encountered a wall that wasn't shown on the building plans. I called for him on the radio but got no response." "How long were you separated?" "Maybe 10 minutes. I followed evacuation protocol and exited the building. I expected Tom to be waiting outside, but he never came out." Detective Santos consulted her notes. The official report states that you immediately notified Captain Mitchell that Walsh was missing. That's correct. We initiated search procedures immediately. But Detective, there's something that wasn't in the official report. Rodriguez stood and walked to a bookshelf where he retrieved a manila folder. I kept my own records of that night. Things I observed but couldn't prove. He handed Detective Santos a handwritten report dated October 16, 1990. The document was 3 pages of detailed observations about the warehouse fire and the search for Thomas Walsh. Page 2, Rodriguez said. 4th paragraph. Detective Santos read aloud. Upon exiting the building, observed Fire Chief Morrison in conversation with unidentified civilian approximately 50 yards from scene. Civilian appeared agitated. Chief Morrison gestured toward building entrance. Conversation lasted approximately 2 minutes before civilian departed in dark sedan. Mr. Rodriguez, why wasn't this included in the official report? Rodriguez returned to his chair. I submitted my complete report to Captain Mitchell the next morning. The version that went into the official file had been edited. The paragraph about Chief Morrison was removed. Who would have authority to edit your report? Only Chief Morrison himself. Detective Santos felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Mr. Rodriguez, I need to ask you directly. Did you believe that Chief Morrison was involved in Thomas Walsh's disappearance? Rodriguez was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Detective, I served under Daniel Morrison for 8 years. I respected him, considered him a friend. But Tom Walsh had been asking questions about response times to certain fires. Questions about equipment failures that seemed to happen at convenient moments. What kind of questions? Tom noticed that fires at certain addresses always seemed to have delayed responses. Radio failures. Equipment malfunctions. Small things that individually meant nothing, but together suggested a pattern. Rodriguez opened the folder again and handed Detective Santos a second document. Tom gave me this 3 days before he disappeared. He asked me to keep it safe. The document was a handwritten analysis of Detroit Fire Department response times for the period January 1989 through September 1990. Walsh had meticulously documented 43 fires where response times exceeded normal parameters. 31 of those fires had occurred at buildings owned by Morrison Properties, LLC. Tom discovered that Chief Morrison owned the building where he disappeared. Tom discovered much more than that. Chief Morrison owned 12 buildings that had convenient fires during his tenure as chief. 7 were total losses. Insurance payouts totaled $2.8 million. Detective Santos studied the document. Thomas Walsh had been building a case for arson and insurance fraud against his own fire chief. Mr. Rodriguez, why didn't you come forward with this information in 1990? Rodriguez's face showed the weight of 17 years of guilt. Because 3 days after Tom disappeared, Chief Morrison called me into his office. He told me that Tom had been unstable, possibly suicidal. He said that coming forward with unfounded accusations would destroy Tom's reputation and hurt his family. But you didn't believe Walsh was suicidal. Tom had just gotten tickets to take his kids to a Tigers game the following weekend. Does that sound like someone planning to kill himself? Rodriguez stood again and walked to his mantelpiece, where a framed photograph showed him in dress uniform receiving a commendation. Morrison promoted me to deputy chief 1 month after Tom disappeared, gave me a $8,000 raise and full authority over personnel assignments. The implication was clear. Rodriguez had been bought off with career advancement and had remained silent about what he knew. Mr. Rodriguez, do you believe Thomas Walsh died in that fire? Rodriguez turned back to face Detective Santos. No. I think Tom discovered something that night that forced him to disappear. I think he's been hiding for 17 years. What could he have discovered? Chief Morrison wasn't working alone. The insurance fraud scheme required inside help, someone to delay responses, cause equipment failures, manage the investigation reports. Tom may have identified Morrison's partners. Detective Santos considered this possibility. If Thomas Walsh had survived the warehouse fire but discovered a conspiracy that included high-ranking fire department officials, going underground might have been his only option for survival. Who were Morrison's closest associates in the department? Rodriguez provided a list of names. Assistant Chief Robert Clark, Battalion Chief Michael Stevens, and Fire Inspector David Park. All three had worked directly with Morrison and had authority to influence fire responses and investigations. Are any of these men still alive? Clark died in 1998. Stevens retired to Florida in 2001. David Park is still in Detroit. He went into private fire safety consulting after leaving the department. Detective Santos made careful notes. David Park represented her best hope for understanding the scope of Morrison's activities and determining whether other officials had participated in the conspiracy. Mr. Rodriguez, if Thomas Walsh has been hiding for 17 years, why would he leave his gear in that warehouse now? Rodriguez considered the question. Maybe he's getting old. Maybe he's sick. Maybe after 17 years, he's ready to tell his story. Or maybe he's dead, and someone else left the gear there as a message. Rodriguez nodded gravely. That's possible too. But Detective, if Tom Walsh is still alive, he's the only person who can provide direct evidence of what really happened. Finding him might be the only way to get justice for what was done. Detective Santos left Frank Rodriguez's house with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer understanding of the conspiracy that had destroyed Thomas Walsh's life. Chief Morrison had used his position to orchestrate insurance fraud, and Thomas Walsh had discovered the scheme. Whether Walsh was still alive remained an open question, but his gear in the warehouse suggested that someone wanted his story to be told. That evening, Detective Santos began planning her approach to David Park, the former fire inspector who might hold the final pieces of the puzzle. She also called Patricia Walsh to inform her that the investigation was expanding beyond a simple missing person case. Mrs. Walsh, it appears that your husband discovered evidence of criminal activity within the fire department. His disappearance was likely not accidental. Patricia Walsh was quiet for a moment. Detective, does this mean Tom might still be alive? It's possible, Mrs. Walsh, but I want you to prepare for any outcome. After 17 years, we may never know exactly what happened to your husband. What we can do is ensure that the people responsible for his disappearance are held accountable. The inspector's secret. David Park owned a fire safety consulting business operating out of a converted warehouse in Detroit's Corktown district, less than 2 miles from where Thomas Walsh's gear had been discovered. The irony wasn't lost on Detective Santos as she parked outside Park Safety Systems and observed the well-maintained building with its prominent signage advertising sprinkler installation and fire code compliance services. Park himself was 58, thin and precise in his movements, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone who had spent decades examining details others might miss. His office walls displayed certificates, awards, and photographs from his 25 years with the Detroit Fire Department. Detective Santos, Park said, shaking her hand with a firm grip, I understand you're investigating Tom Walsh's disappearance. Terrible tragedy. Tom was a good firefighter. Mr. Park, I'm specifically interested in your role as fire inspector during Chief Morrison's administration. Several irregularities have come to light regarding response times and equipment failures during that period. Park's demeanor shifted subtly. The friendly cooperation became more guarded, more professional. Detective, fire investigation is complex work. What might appear irregular to someone outside the department often has logical explanations. I'm referring to systematic patterns of delayed responses to fires at buildings owned by Morrison Properties. Park walked to his desk and sat down, gesturing for Detective Santos to take the chair across from him. Detective, Chief Morrison was a respected leader who served during one of Detroit's most challenging periods. The department was understaffed, underfunded, and dealing with an unprecedented number of structure fires. Mr. Park, Thomas Walsh documented 43 incidents where response times exceeded normal parameters. 31 of those incidents involved properties owned by Chief Morrison's company. Tom Walsh was an excellent firefighter, but he wasn't trained in fire investigation protocols. Response times can be affected by dozens of variables: traffic conditions, equipment availability, crew assignments, concurrent emergencies. Detective Santos opened her folder and placed Frank Rodriguez's handwritten report on Park's desk. This document suggests that Walsh had identified a pattern of deliberate delays and equipment failures. Park examined the document carefully, his expression revealing nothing. "Detective, I see statistical correlations, but correlation doesn't prove causation. Without direct evidence of deliberate misconduct, these numbers are just data points." What about the fact that Chief Morrison removed Frank Rodriguez's observations about Morrison's presence at the scene from the official report? "I wasn't involved in report editing. That would have been an administrative decision made above my level." Detective Santos could see that Park was providing careful, legally defensible answers that revealed nothing incriminating. She decided to try a different approach. "Mr. Park, the warehouse where Walsh disappeared was owned by Morrison Properties. Walsh's gear was found in another warehouse, suggesting he survived the fire and went into hiding. If Walsh discovered evidence of insurance fraud, he would have represented a threat to everyone involved in the scheme." Park removed his glasses and cleaned them methodically. "Detective, you're asking me to speculate about events that occurred 17 years ago based on incomplete information. As a fire safety professional, I deal in facts, not theories." "Then let's discuss facts. How many buildings owned by Morrison Properties experienced total loss fires during the period 1987 through 1995? "I wouldn't have that information readily available." 7 buildings. Insurance payouts totaling $2.8 million. All fires occurred during Chief Morrison's tenure. Park replaced his glasses and leaned back in his chair. Property ownership and fire occurrence can be coincidental. Chief Morrison owned real estate in Detroit during a period when the city experienced high rates of structural fires. Detective Santos realized that Park wasn't going to provide voluntary cooperation. His answers were too prepared, too careful. She decided to apply pressure. "Mr. Park, I have evidence suggesting that Thomas Walsh was building a case for arson and insurance fraud against Chief Morrison. Walsh's disappearance prevented him from presenting that evidence. Someone in the fire department had to help Morrison cover up the scheme." Park's expression hardened. "Detective, are you accusing me of criminal activity?" "I'm investigating criminal activity. Whether you were a participant or simply someone who chose to remain silent, I need to understand your role." Park stood and walked to his window, looking out at the Detroit skyline. "Detective Santos, Chief Morrison is dead. Frank Rodriguez is retired. Tom Walsh has been missing for 17 years. Why are you reopening old wounds?" "Because new evidence has surfaced. Because a family deserves to know what happened to their husband and father. Because if crimes were committed, the people responsible should be held accountable." Park turned back to face her. "And if pursuing this investigation destroys the reputations of men who served their community for decades? If it tears apart families who have spent years grieving their losses? Then that's the price of justice." Park was quiet for several long moments. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of years of suppressed guilt. "Detective, I'm going to tell you something off the record. Chief Morrison was not a criminal mastermind orchestrating elaborate insurance fraud. He was a man under enormous pressure who made some questionable decisions." "Ooh, what kind of questionable decisions?" "Morrison owned properties that became fire hazards. Abandoned buildings, illegal occupancies, deferred maintenance. When those buildings caught fire naturally, he didn't object to insurance settlements that might have been generous." "Are you saying the fires weren't deliberately set?" "I'm saying that most of the fires occurred naturally, but the response protocols were sometimes adjusted to ensure total losses rather than partial damage." This was a significant admission. Detective Santos pressed for details. "How were response protocols adjusted?" Park hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to continue. "Equipment failures were not always mechanical failures. Radio problems were sometimes communication problems. Response delays were sometimes routing problems. You're describing deliberate sabotage of firefighting efforts. I'm describing decisions made under pressure during chaotic situations. When an abandoned building was burning, and when a total loss would provide insurance money that could be used for community improvement, sometimes the immediate firefighting response was not aggressive." Detective Santos felt anger rising in her chest. "Mr. Park, firefighters put their lives at risk based on the assumption that they have full department support. Deliberately sabotaging equipment or communications puts lives in danger. No one was supposed to get hurt. These were abandoned buildings, vacant properties. The protocol adjustments only applied to structures where no lives were at risk. Except that Thomas Walsh was in the building on Gratiot Avenue, and his life was very much at risk. Park sat down heavily in his chair. Tom wasn't supposed to be in that building. The fire was supposed to occur during a shift when Engine Company 47 was off duty. The admission hung in the air between them. Park had just confessed to advanced knowledge of a fire that was supposed to appear accidental. Mr. Park, are you telling me that the fire at 1247 Gratiot Avenue was deliberately set? Park looked directly at Detective Santos for the first time since their conversation had turned serious. Detective, I'm telling you that Tom Walsh discovered something that night that he wasn't supposed to discover. And because of that discovery, a good man disappeared and a family was destroyed. What did Walsh discover? Oh, why? He found evidence that the building had been prepared for an insurance fire. Accelerants, disabled smoke detectors, strategic removal of valuable materials. When Tom radioed in his observations, Chief Morrison realized that the operation had been compromised. Detective Santos leaned forward. What happened next? Chief Morrison ordered all units to evacuate the building immediately. But Tom Walsh refused to leave. He said he was collecting evidence and would exit after documenting what he had found. And then? Park removed his glasses again, this time to wipe his eyes. Tom Walsh never came out of that building. But the building didn't collapse. The fire was extinguished with minimal structural damage. When we searched the building afterward, we found no trace of Tom, but we also found no evidence of the accelerants he had reported. Someone removed the evidence while Walsh was still inside? Chief Morrison sent me into the building with a cleanup crew 30 minutes after the fire was declared under control. We were told to secure the scene and prepare for investigation. But our real job was to remove any evidence that might support Walsh's accusations. Detective Santos felt the case crystallizing around Morrison's conspiracy. Mr. Park, what happened to Thomas Walsh? I don't know. When we searched the building, we found signs that someone had been in the basement during the fire. Fresh air had been circulated through utility tunnels. But no body, no equipment, nothing. You think Walsh escaped through the basement? I think Tom Walsh was smarter than Morrison gave him credit for. I think he realized what was happening and found a way to survive. But he also realized that coming forward with his evidence would put his family in danger. Detective Santos considered this possibility. If Walsh had survived, but recognized that he was dealing with a conspiracy involving multiple fire department officials, disappearing might have been his only option. Mr. Park, why are you telling me this now? Park stood and walked to a filing cabinet, from which he retrieved a thick manila envelope. Because I've carried this guilt for 17 years. Because Chief Morrison is dead and can't be hurt by the truth. And because Tom Walsh's family deserves to know what really happened. He handed Detective Santos the envelope. These are photographs I took inside the building on Gratiot Avenue before Morrison's cleanup crew removed the evidence. Tom Walsh was right. The building had been prepared for an insurance fire. Detective Santos opened the envelope and found dozens of photographs showing clear evidence of arson. Burn patterns indicating accelerant use, disabled safety systems, and strategic placement of combustible materials. Mr. Park, this is evidence of multiple felonies. Why didn't you come forward in 1990? Because Chief Morrison told me that Walsh had gone crazy, that he was making false accusations to cover up his own mistakes. Morrison said that if I supported Walsh's claims, I would be ending my career and destroying my family's financial security. So you chose job security over justice? Park nodded, tears in his eyes. Yes, and I've regretted that choice every day for 17 years. Detective Santos studied the photographs. They provided clear evidence of arson, but they also raised new questions about Thomas Walsh's fate. If he had discovered this evidence and escaped the building, where had he gone? Why had he never contacted his family? And why had his gear appeared in another warehouse after 17 years? Mr. Park, do you believe Thomas Walsh is still alive? I hope so. But, Detective, if Tom is alive, he's been hiding from people who were willing to let him die in a burning building to protect their secrets. Even with Chief Morrison dead, Tom might not feel safe coming forward. Who else was involved in the conspiracy? Park provided names: Assistant Chief Robert Clark, who had managed response scheduling; Battalion Chief Michael Stevens, who had overseen equipment maintenance; and Fire Inspector William Hayes, who had filed fraudulent investigation reports. How extensive was the operation? 7 buildings over 8 years. Total insurance fraud of nearly $3 million. The money was supposed to be used for neighborhood revitalization, but most of it went into Morrison's personal accounts. Detective Santos realized that she was dealing with a complex criminal conspiracy that had operated for years within the Detroit Fire Department. Thomas Walsh had discovered the scheme and either died trying to expose it or had been forced into hiding to protect himself and his family. "Mr. Park, I need you to make a formal statement about everything you've told me. This case is going to require a full investigation." Park nodded. "Detective, I'm ready to face the consequences of what I did and didn't do. But please remember that there were good people in the department who never knew what was happening. Don't let Morrison's crimes destroy the reputation of firefighters who served honestly." As Detective Santos left Park's office with the envelope of photographs, she knew that the investigation had reached a critical point. She had evidence of criminal conspiracy, but she still didn't know what had happened to Thomas Walsh. The discovery of his gear in the warehouse suggested that someone wanted his story to be told, but whether that someone was Walsh himself or someone acting on his behalf remained unknown. That evening she called Patricia Walsh to provide an update on the investigation. "Mrs. Walsh, we've uncovered evidence of criminal activity involving Chief Morrison and other fire department officials. Your husband appears to have discovered an insurance fraud scheme. Does this mean Tom is innocent of any wrongdoing?" "Your husband was a hero, Mrs. Walsh. He risked his life to expose corruption, and he may have paid the ultimate price for his integrity." "Detective, do you think my husband is still alive?" Detective Santos chose her words carefully. "Mrs. Walsh, I think your husband was a survivor. After 17 years, I can't make promises about what we'll find, but I can promise you that we'll learn the truth about what happened that night." The basement discovery. The next morning, Detective Santos obtained a warrant to search the basement of the building at 1247 Gratiot Avenue, where Thomas Walsh had disappeared. The structure was now city property, scheduled for demolition, which simplified the legal process. She arranged to meet Jake Morrison at the site, reasoning that his construction expertise might help identify any structural modifications that could explain how Walsh had escaped. Jake arrived at the building with industrial lighting equipment and basement inspection tools. Despite the uncomfortable connection to his father's activities, he had agreed to assist with the search. Detective Santos suspected that Jake's cooperation stemmed from a desire to understand the extent of his father's involvement in the conspiracy. The building was a 3-story brick structure that had housed a furniture warehouse until 1989. City records showed it had been vacant for 14 months before the October 1990 fire. The exterior showed obvious fire damage on the second floor, but the structure remained sound. "The basement entrance is around back," Jake said, leading Detective Santos to a steel door that had been secured with a city padlock. "Most of these old warehouses have basement loading areas for freight delivery." Jake cut the padlock and opened the door, revealing a concrete stairway leading into darkness. The basement was larger than Detective Santos had expected, extending under the entire footprint of the building, with concrete pillars supporting the upper floors. "Over here," Jake called, his flashlight beam illuminating the far corner of the basement. "Someone definitely lived down here." The evidence was unmistakable. A sleeping area created with cardboard and old blankets, empty food containers, and a makeshift washing area near a utility sink. But most significantly, there were signs of recent habitation. The food containers included items with expiration dates from 2006 and 2007. "Detective, look at this," Jake said, kneeling beside a wooden crate that had been used as a table. "Someone left this for us to find." On the crate was a manila envelope with "Detective Santos, DPD," written in block letters. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter dated March 15, 2007, just 10 days before Jake had discovered Walsh's gear in the warehouse. Detective Santos read the letter aloud. "Detective Santos, My name is Thomas Walsh. I have been hiding in Detroit for 17 years because I discovered that Fire Chief Daniel Morrison and other department officials were committing arson and insurance fraud. I survived the fire at 1247 Gratiot Avenue on October 15, 1990, but I knew that coming forward with evidence would put my family in danger. I have been living in abandoned buildings and watching my wife and children from a distance, unable to contact them because Morrison threatened to kill them if I ever surfaced. Chief Morrison is dead now, but some of his partners are still alive. I am old and sick, and I may not survive much longer. I left my gear in the warehouse on Jefferson Avenue because I knew someone would eventually find it and investigate. The evidence you need is hidden in this basement. I hope that my family can finally learn the truth about what happened. Thomas Walsh. Detective Santos felt her heart racing. Thomas Walsh was alive, or had been alive as recently as 2 weeks ago. She immediately began searching the basement for the evidence Walsh had mentioned. Jake found it first, a waterproof container hidden behind a loose brick in the basement wall. Inside were documents that Walsh had accumulated over 17 years of secret investigation. Photographs of Morrison Properties buildings before and after fires, insurance claim documents, financial records showing money transfers, and detailed logs of Walsh's observations. He's been investigating this case for 17 years, Detective Santos said, examining Walsh's meticulous records. He documented everything, every building, every insurance claim, every person involved in the conspiracy. The most damaging evidence was a series of photographs showing Chief Morrison meeting with known arsonists at various locations around Detroit. Walsh had somehow managed to photograph these meetings without being detected, creating a visual record of the conspiracy. "Detective, there's something else," Jake said, holding up a medical prescription bottle with Walsh's name on it. "This is dated February 2007. The medication is for advanced lung cancer." The prescription explained Walsh's decision to finally come forward with his evidence. He was dying and had decided to risk exposure to ensure that his family learned the truth about his disappearance. Detective Santos called for additional units to secure the scene and process all evidence. She also put out a citywide bolo for Thomas Walsh, though she suspected that he had chosen his revelation timing carefully and might no longer be in Detroit. As crime scene technicians worked to catalog Walsh's hidden evidence, Detective Santos called Patricia Walsh. "Mrs. Walsh, I need you to sit down. We've found evidence that your husband is alive." The silence on the phone lasted nearly 30 seconds. "Detective, are you certain?" "We found a letter dated 2 weeks ago. Your husband has been living in hiding in Detroit for 17 years. He left evidence that proves Chief Morrison and others were involved in insurance fraud." Patricia Walsh began crying. Tears of relief, confusion, and 17 years of suppressed grief. "Where is he now?" "We don't know. But Mrs. Walsh, your husband is seriously ill. The evidence suggests he has advanced lung cancer. He may have decided to reveal the truth because he doesn't have much time left. I want to see him. We're searching for him now." "Mrs. Walsh, your husband's letter indicates that he stayed away from your family to protect you from Chief Morrison's threats. He's been watching over you and your children for 17 years, unable to make contact." The emotional impact of this revelation was overwhelming. Thomas Walsh had sacrificed his life with his family to ensure their safety, living in hiding while watching them grow up from a distance. That afternoon, Detective Santos received a call from Detroit Receiving Hospital. "Detective, we have a patient here who matches the description in your bolo. Thomas Walsh was admitted this morning with respiratory failure." Detective Santos and Patricia Walsh arrived at the hospital within 30 minutes. Thomas Walsh lay in intensive care, connected to oxygen and monitoring equipment. He was 58 now, thin and frail from years of poor living conditions and advancing cancer. But his eyes were alert, and he smiled when he saw Patricia enter the room. "I'm sorry," were his first words. "I'm sorry I couldn't come home." Patricia took his hand and held it tightly. "Tom, you did what you had to do to protect us." Detective Santos waited while the couple had their private reunion, but she needed Walsh's testimony to complete the case against the surviving conspirators. After 30 minutes, she approached Walsh's bedside. Mr. Walsh, I need to record your statement about what happened in 1990 and the years since. Are you able to provide testimony? Walsh nodded weakly. I've been waiting 17 years to tell this story. Over the next 2 hours, Thomas Walsh provided detailed testimony about discovering Chief Morrison's arson scheme, surviving the fire through basement utility tunnels that connected to adjacent buildings, and his years in hiding while continuing to investigate the conspiracy. I wanted to come home every day, Walsh said, but Morrison made it clear that if I ever surfaced, if I ever tried to contact Patricia or the children, he would kill them. I couldn't risk their lives. Mr. Walsh, why did you decide to reveal the evidence now? Because I'm dying, and because Morrison is dead. I figured that with the chief gone, the threat to my family was reduced. I wanted Patricia to know the truth before I died. Detective Santos had enough evidence to prosecute the surviving members of Morrison's conspiracy. David Park had already agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges. The documentation Walsh had accumulated over 17 years provided irrefutable proof of systematic insurance fraud. But the human cost of the conspiracy was immeasurable. Thomas Walsh had lost 17 years with his family. Patricia Walsh had raised their children alone, believing her husband was dead. The children had grown up without their father because of Chief Morrison's criminal enterprise. As Detective Santos prepared to leave the hospital, Thomas Walsh called her back to his bedside. Detective, there's one more thing. Chief Morrison had a partner outside the fire department, someone who helped identify target buildings and arrange insurance policies. I never could prove who it was, but I have suspicions. Who? Someone in the city planning department. Someone who knew which buildings were scheduled for demolition and which ones carried high insurance values. This revelation opened another avenue of investigation. The conspiracy had extended beyond the fire department into city government, suggesting a level of corruption that could involve dozens of officials and millions of dollars in fraudulent claims. Thomas Walsh died 3 days later, surrounded by his family. He had lived long enough to tell his story and ensure that the truth about Chief Morrison's crimes would be exposed. His funeral was attended by hundreds of firefighters who honored him as a hero who had sacrificed everything to maintain his integrity. The planning connection. Detective Santos spent the week following Thomas Walsh's funeral reviewing his extensive documentation and following up on his final revelation about corruption in the city planning department. Walsh's records included detailed observations about city officials who had seemed unusually knowledgeable about upcoming fires and insurance claims. Her investigation led to Harold Brennan, who had served as Detroit's Director of Urban Development from 1987 to 1996. Brennan was now 71, retired and living in a Grosse Pointe mansion that seemed far too expensive for someone who had spent his career in public service. Detective Santos arranged a meeting under the pretext of seeking historical information about Detroit's urban planning during the 1990s. Brennan agreed to meet at his home, apparently unconcerned about discussing his former role in city government. Brennan was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His home office was filled with awards, photographs with mayors and city council members, and architectural drawings of Detroit development projects. Detective Santos, I understand you're investigating some old fire department cases, Brennan said, offering her coffee from an expensive service set. Those were challenging times for Detroit. The city was struggling with budget constraints and infrastructure problems. Mr. Brennan, I'm specifically interested in coordination between the planning department and fire department regarding abandoned buildings and demolition schedules. Coordination was essential. We had hundreds of abandoned structures that posed safety hazards. The fire department needed advance notice about which buildings were scheduled for demolition, so they could adjust their response protocols accordingly. Detective Santos consulted Walsh's notes. Mr. Brennan, Thomas Walsh documented several instances where buildings caught fire just days before they were scheduled for demolition. Did your department provide advance notice of demolition schedules to fire department officials? Brennan's expression remained neutral. Standard operating procedure. Fire Chief Morrison received weekly updates about demolition schedules, building permits, and occupancy status changes. Were these communications documented? Of course. All interdepartmental communications were required to be in writing and filed with appropriate oversight agencies. Detective Santos knew that Walsh's evidence suggested a more direct relationship between Brennan and Morrison than routine administrative coordination. Mr. Brennan, did you have personal relationships with Fire Chief Morrison outside of your official duties? Brennan paused, seeming to consider his answer carefully. Detective, Chief Morrison and I worked closely on numerous projects. Detroit's urban renewal efforts required coordination between multiple departments. We occasionally socialized at city functions and professional events. Did you ever discuss specific buildings or properties in non-official settings? I'm sure we discussed work-related matters in various settings. When you're dealing with complex urban planning issues, conversations continue beyond normal business hours. Detective Santos realized that Brennan was providing carefully worded answers that acknowledged relationships without admitting to impropriety. She decided to present more specific evidence. Mr. Brennan, Thomas Walsh documented that you attended several meetings with Chief Morrison and David Park at locations outside City Hall. These meetings occurred in the weeks before significant fires at Morrison Properties buildings. Brennan's demeanor shifted slightly. Detective, if Thomas Walsh was conducting surveillance of city officials, that raises questions about his mental state and the reliability of his observations. Mr. Walsh was conducting an investigation of criminal activity. His documentation has proven accurate in every detail we've been able to verify. What exactly are you suggesting? Detective Santos opened her folder and placed photographs on Brennan's desk. Images that Walsh had somehow obtained showing Brennan, Morrison, and Park meeting in a restaurant parking lot in September 1990. I'm suggesting that you were part of Chief Morrison's insurance fraud scheme. You provided inside information about building values, demolition schedules, and insurance policies. In exchange, you received payment from the fraudulent insurance claims. Brennan examined the photographs with the same careful attention he had given to architectural drawings. Detective, I see photographs of city officials meeting to discuss urban planning matters. I don't see evidence of criminal activity. Mr. Brennan, 7 buildings owned by Morrison Properties experienced convenient fires during your tenure as Urban Development Director. Those buildings had a combined insurance value of $2.8 million. 4 of them were scheduled for demolition within 30 days of their fires. Buildings scheduled for demolition are often in poor condition and more susceptible to fires. The correlation you're describing could be entirely coincidental. Detective Santos could see that Brennan was not going to provide voluntary cooperation. She needed additional evidence to prove his involvement in the conspiracy. Mr. Brennan, I'll need you to provide financial records for the period 1987 through 1996. Bank statements, investment accounts, major purchases. Detective, am I being accused of a crime? You're part of an ongoing investigation into conspiracy, arson, and insurance fraud. I can obtain warrants for your financial records, or you can cooperate voluntarily. Brennan stood and walked to his window, looking out at his well-maintained garden and expensive landscaping. Detective, I served the city of Detroit faithfully for 32 years. My decisions were always made in the best interests of urban development and public safety. Even if those decisions included helping Chief Morrison identify buildings that could be burned for insurance money? Brennan turned back to face her. I provided information about building conditions, insurance policies, and demolition schedules because it was my job to coordinate urban planning with public safety agencies. And if that information was used to commit crimes, I cannot be held responsible for how other people chose to use information I provided in good faith. Detective Santos realized that Brennan was taking the position that he had been an unwitting contributor to Morrison's scheme, rather than an active participant. This defense might be legally viable, but Walsh's documentation suggested more direct involvement. Mr. Brennan, Thomas Walsh recorded a conversation between you and Chief Morrison in October 1990, where you discussed specific insurance valuations for buildings that hadn't yet caught fire. This was actually a bluff. Walsh's records didn't include audio recordings, But Detective Santos wanted to gauge Brennan's reaction. Brennan sat back down, his composure finally cracking slightly. "Detective, if such conversations occurred, they would have been part of routine planning discussions about potential liability issues. Mr. Brennan, routine planning discussions don't occur in secret meetings in parking lots." Brennan was quiet for several long moments. When he spoke again, his voice carried less confidence than before. "Detective, urban planning in Detroit during the 1990s was complicated by budget constraints, political pressures, and community safety concerns. Sometimes decisions had to be made quickly and with limited oversight." "What kind of decisions?" "So, if a building posed an immediate safety hazard, and if demolition funding wasn't available through normal channels, alternative solutions had to be considered." "Are you saying that insurance fires were considered a legitimate form of urban renewal?" Brennan stood again, this time moving toward his desk where he began organizing papers with nervous energy. "I'm saying that when the city lacked resources to address dangerous buildings through conventional means, creative solutions were sometimes necessary." Detective Santos felt she was getting closer to a confession. "Mr. Brennan, did you help Chief Morrison identify buildings that could be safely burned?" "I provided information about building conditions, occupancy status, and insurance coverage. If that information influenced fire department response protocols, those decisions were made by fire department officials." "But you knew that the information would be used to facilitate insurance fires?" Brennan stopped organizing his papers and looked directly at Detective Santos. "I knew that some buildings were going to burn whether we wanted them to or not. Detroit had hundreds of abandoned structures that were fire hazards. If those fires could generate insurance money that would be used for community improvement, that seemed better than letting buildings burn with no recovery of value." This was a significant admission. Brennan had acknowledged knowing that insurance fires would occur, and that he had provided information to facilitate those fires. "Mr. Brennan, what was your financial relationship with Chief Morrison?" "I didn't receive direct payments from insurance claims, but the Urban Development Department did receive additional funding for renewal projects during Chief Morrison's tenure." "How much additional funding?" Brennan returned to his desk and pulled out a folder of financial documents. "Approximately $400,000 over 8 years. The money was designated for neighborhood revitalization in areas affected by structural fires." Detective Santos realized that Brennan had been paid for his cooperation, but the payments had been disguised as legitimate urban development funding. This arrangement had provided both men with plausible deniability while allowing them to profit from the insurance fraud scheme. "Mr. Brennan, I need you to come to the police station tomorrow to provide a formal statement." "You can bring an attorney if you wish." Brennan nodded slowly. "Detective, I want you to understand that our intentions were to improve the city. Detroit was dying in 1990. Conventional urban planning wasn't working. We thought we had found a way to turn abandoned buildings into resources for community development. Mr. Brennan, your good intentions don't justify arson and insurance fraud. And they certainly don't justify the threat made against Thomas Walsh and his family. I never threatened anyone. If Chief Morrison made threats, those were his decisions, not mine." Detective Santos gathered her materials and prepared to leave. She had enough evidence to charge Brennan with conspiracy and fraud, but she suspected there were other city officials involved in the scheme. Brennan's cooperation might be essential to identifying the full extent of the corruption. "Mr. Brennan, I'll see you tomorrow at the police station. I suggest you spend tonight thinking about whether you want to cooperate fully with this investigation or face charges as a co-conspirator in multiple felonies." Wine. As Detective Santos left Brennan's mansion, she reflected on the scope of the conspiracy Thomas Walsh had uncovered. The insurance fraud scheme had involved not only fire department officials, but also city planners, who had used their positions to facilitate crimes while justifying their actions as urban renewal efforts. The human cost remained staggering. Thomas Walsh had lost 17 years with his family. Patricia Walsh had raised 2 children as a single mother, believing her husband was dead, and the children had grown up without their father. All of this suffering had been caused by public officials who had prioritized financial gain over public service and human decency. The full confession. Harold Brennan arrived at the Detroit Police Department the following morning, accompanied by attorney Margaret Foster, a prominent criminal defense lawyer whose presence suggested that Brennan was taking the charges seriously. Detective Santos conducted the interview in Conference Room B with Assistant District Attorney James Mitchell observing and recording the session. "Mr. Brennan," Detective Santos began, "you've been informed of your rights. Do you understand that this interview is being recorded and that anything you say can be used in legal proceedings?" "Yes," Brennan replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Yesterday you acknowledged providing information to Fire Chief Morrison that you knew would be used to facilitate insurance fires. I need you to provide specific details about your role in this conspiracy." Brennan looked at his attorney, who nodded for him to proceed. "Detective, the arrangement began in early 1987, shortly after Daniel Morrison became fire chief. The city was facing severe budget cuts, and the Urban Development Department was being asked to address abandoned building problems with reduced resources. How did you first become involved with Chief Morrison's activities?" "Chief Morrison approached me with a proposal. He said that certain abandoned buildings were going to burn naturally due to arson by transients, electrical problems, or general decay. His suggestion was that we could coordinate these inevitable fires to maximize recovery value through insurance claims." Ada Mitchell leaned forward. "Mr. Brennan, are you saying that Chief Morrison told you he was going to deliberately set fires?" "Not initially. Morrison's original proposal was that we would identify buildings most likely to experience natural fires and ensure that those buildings carried adequate insurance coverage. The idea was to recover value from structures that were going to be lost anyway." Detective Santos consulted her notes. "When did the arrangement change from passive insurance recovery to active arson?" Brennan was quiet for several moments. His attorney whispered something in his ear, and he nodded before continuing. "The arrangement changed in late 1987 when Morrison realized that natural fires weren't occurring quickly enough to generate the revenue we needed for urban development projects. Morrison suggested that we could accelerate the process by ensuring that fire-prone buildings experienced fires on schedule." "Mr. Brennan, you're describing deliberate arson. I'm describing urban renewal through controlled demolition. The buildings we targeted were abandoned, structurally unsound, and located in neighborhoods that needed revitalization. The fires removed dangerous structures and provided insurance money for community improvement." Detective Santos could see that Brennan was still trying to justify his actions as legitimate urban planning rather than criminal conspiracy. "Mr. Brennan, how were the target buildings selected?" "I provided Morrison with lists of abandoned properties that met specific criteria: minimal historical value, no current occupancy, high insurance coverage, and location in neighborhoods designated for renewal." "How many buildings were involved over the 8-year period?" Brennan consulted documents his attorney had brought. 17 buildings total. 7 were owned by Morrison Properties. 10 were owned by various private parties who cooperated with the program." "What do you mean by cooperated with the program?" "Property owners who were struggling with maintenance costs and insurance premiums on abandoned buildings. We offered them an opportunity to recover their investment through coordinated insurance claims." Ada Mitchell made notes. "Mr. Brennan, are you saying that private property owners paid to have their buildings burned?" "Private property owners paid fees to the Urban Development Department for expedited demolition and site preparation services. The actual fires were managed by the fire department as part of their controlled burn training program." Detective Santos realized that Brennan had helped Morrison create a systematic arson-for-hire operation disguised as legitimate urban planning and fire department training. "Mr. Brennan, what was your personal compensation for participating in this arrangement?" "The Urban Development Department received $50,000 annually for coordination services. My personal salary was not directly affected." "Shh, but you received other benefits?" Brennan looked again at his attorney before answering. "I received performance bonuses based on successful completion of urban renewal projects. Between 1987 and 1996, these bonuses totaled approximately $180,000. "Mr. Brennan, how was Thomas Walsh's investigation discovered?" In October 1990, Morrison told me that one of his firefighters was asking questions about response times and equipment failures. Morrison was concerned that Walsh was documenting patterns that might expose our coordination activities. What did you advise Morrison to do? I told Morrison that Walsh's concerns could be addressed through proper departmental channels. I suggested transferring Walsh to a different unit, or providing him with alternative assignments that would limit his access to sensitive information. But Morrison chose a different solution. Brennan's composure finally cracked completely. Morrison told me that Walsh had discovered evidence of our arrangement and was planning to present it to federal investigators. Morrison said that Walsh represented a threat to everyone involved in the program. What did Morrison propose to do about that threat? Morrison said that Walsh would have to be neutralized. I thought he meant transferred or forced to retire. I didn't realize he meant— Brennan's voice trailed off. Mr. Brennan, did Chief Morrison tell you that he was planning to murder Thomas Walsh? Morrison told me that Walsh would disappear during a fire, and that his disappearance would be explained as a line-of-duty death. I thought Morrison was talking about arranging Walsh's death in a way that would look accidental. Detective Santos felt her anger rising. Mr. Brennan, you're describing premeditated murder. I'm describing what Morrison told me he was going to do. I didn't approve of his plan, but I also didn't try to stop him. Why didn't you warn Walsh or contact other authorities? Brennan looked down at his hands. Because I was afraid that Morrison would expose my role in the insurance fraud if I didn't cooperate with his plan to handle the Walsh problem. Ada Mitchell leaned forward again. Mr. Brennan, you chose to protect yourself rather than prevent a murder. Yes, and I've regretted that choice every day for 17 years. Detective Santos needed to understand the full scope of Morrison's plan. Mr. Brennan, what was supposed to happen to Thomas Walsh during the fire at 1247 Gratiot Avenue? Sir, Morrison planned to send Walsh into the building alone while the rest of the crew remained outside. The building had been prepared with accelerants and structural weakening to ensure rapid collapse. Walsh was supposed to be trapped inside when the building fell. But the plan failed because Walsh escaped through the basement. Morrison didn't know about the utility tunnels that connected the basement to adjacent buildings. Walsh used those tunnels to escape after discovering the arson evidence. What did Morrison do when he realized that Walsh had survived? Morrison initiated a manhunt. He used fire department resources and contacts in other city agencies to search for Walsh. Morrison also made it clear to Walsh's family that any attempt by Walsh to surface would result in harm to his wife and children. Detective Santos now understood why Thomas Walsh had remained in hiding for 17 years. Morrison had created a situation where Walsh's survival depended on his family never knowing he was alive. Mr. Brennan, who else in city government knew about the insurance fraud scheme? Brennan provided a list of names. Deputy Mayor Robert Chen, Building Inspector Lisa Rodriguez, and City Attorney Michael Park. All had received payments disguised as consulting fees or performance bonuses. How much money was involved in the overall conspiracy? Insurance claims totaled approximately $2 million over 9 years. After payments to property owners and operational expenses, the net profit was approximately $1.8 million, which was distributed among participants. Detective Santos realized that Morrison's conspiracy had been far more extensive and profitable than anyone had suspected. 17 buildings had been deliberately burned, generating nearly $2 million in illegal profits for corrupt city officials. Mr. Brennan, are you willing to testify against the surviving members of this conspiracy? Brennan looked at his attorney, who nodded. Yes, Detective. I'm prepared to provide complete cooperation in exchange for consideration during sentencing. Ada Mitchell made final notes. Mr. Brennan, you'll be formally charged with conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to attempted murder. Your cooperation will be taken into consideration, but you should understand that you're facing significant prison time. As the interview concluded, Detective Santos reflected on the scope of Thomas Walsh's sacrifice. Walsh had discovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Detroit city government. His 17-year exile had protected not only his own family, but potentially other firefighters who might have stumbled onto Morrison's operation. The case was now ready for prosecution. Detective Santos had confessions from David Park and Harold Brennan, documentary evidence provided by Thomas Walsh, and testimony from Frank Rodriguez. The surviving members of Morrison's conspiracy would face justice, even though the mastermind himself had escaped earthly accountability through death. But the human cost remained immeasurable. Thomas Walsh had died without seeing his children graduate from high school or college. Patricia Walsh had spent 17 years grieving a husband who was alive but unable to contact her. The ripple effects of Morrison's crimes had destroyed multiple families and corrupted institutions that were supposed to serve the public good. The network exposed, with Harold Brennan's confession providing a roadmap to the full extent of Morrison's conspiracy. Detective Santos began the process of tracking down and arresting the remaining participants. Assistant District Attorney James Mitchell had assembled a task force to handle what was now being called the largest municipal corruption case in Detroit's history. The first arrest was Deputy Mayor Robert Chen, now 64, and serving as a private consultant to municipal governments across the Midwest. Chen was taken into custody at his Birmingham office, where FBI agents executed a warrant to seize financial records dating back to 1987. Chen's initial response was to deny any knowledge of insurance fraud or arson activities. But when confronted with bank records showing $127,000 in unexplained deposits between 1988 and 1995, and with Harold Brennan's detailed testimony about Chen's role in selecting target buildings, his position shifted quickly. "I provided general oversight of urban development policies," Chen told Detective Santos during his first interview. "If specific implementation of those policies involved irregular activities, I wasn't directly aware of those activities. Mr. Chen, you received consulting payments totaling more than $125,000 from Morrison Properties during the period when 17 buildings owned or selected by that company experienced convenient fires. Odi. The payments were for legitimate consulting services related to zoning compliance and permit expediting." Detective Santos placed Chen's bank records on the table. "Mr. Chen, these deposits occur within 30 days of major insurance payouts from Morrison Properties fires. The correlation is too precise to be coincidental." Chen's attorney, David Walsh, ironically sharing the same last name as the murdered firefighter, though unrelated, advised his client to consider a cooperation agreement. "Detective, my client is willing to discuss his limited role in urban development coordination, if such cooperation would be viewed favorably by prosecutors." Over the next 4 hours, Chen provided details about his participation in what he insisted was a legitimate urban renewal program. According to Chen, Morrison had presented the Insurance Recovery Initiative as an innovative approach to addressing Detroit's abandoned building crisis. Chief Morrison explained that the city lacked resources for conventional demolition and site preparation, Chen said. His proposal was to coordinate controlled burns of abandoned structures as part of fire department training exercises, with insurance recovery helping to fund neighborhood revitalization. Mr. Chen, did Morrison explain how he intended to ensure that these training exercises would result in total losses rather than controlled burns? Morrison said that fire department protocols could be adjusted to maximize training value while ensuring complete structure removal. Detective Santos realized that Chen, like other participants, had been presented with a version of the scheme that emphasized urban planning benefits while minimizing the criminal aspects. "Mr. Chen, when did you realize that the program involved deliberate arson rather than controlled training exercises?" Chen was quiet for several minutes. "In 1989, I attended a coordination meeting where Morrison discussed accelerant placement and structural weakening techniques. It became clear that these were not conventional training exercises. What did you do with that knowledge?" "I expressed concerns about liability and legal exposure. Morrison assured me that all activities were being conducted within legal parameters and that appropriate permits and authorizations were being obtained through proper channels." "But you continued to receive payments even after you suspected criminal activity?" Chen's attorney intervened. "Detective, my client's cooperation should be viewed in the context of complex municipal governance issues and unclear legal boundaries regarding urban renewal initiatives. Detective Santos wasn't impressed by the legal maneuvering. Mr. Chen, Thomas Walsh discovered evidence of your conspiracy in October 1990. Did Chief Morrison discuss Walsh's investigation with you? Oh, Morrison mentioned that a firefighter was asking questions about response protocols. Morrison said the situation was being handled through internal department procedures. Mr. Chen, did Morrison tell you that Walsh was going to be killed? Chen's face went pale. Morrison never used the word killed. Srater. He said that Walsh would be transferred to a different assignment where his concerns about response times wouldn't be relevant. But you knew that Walsh disappeared during a suspicious fire at a building owned by Morrison Properties. I knew that Walsh was reported missing during a fire. Morrison told me that Walsh had been overcome by smoke and that his body would probably never be recovered due to structural collapse. Detective Santos could see that Chen had chosen willful ignorance over direct knowledge of Morrison's murder plan, but his financial benefits from the conspiracy made him legally culpable, regardless of his claimed ignorance. The next arrest was Building Inspector Lisa Rodriguez, who had provided insider information about building conditions, insurance valuations, and inspection schedules. Rodriguez was 59 and had remained with the city in various capacities since her involvement with Morrison's conspiracy. Unlike Chen, Rodriguez immediately acknowledged her participation when confronted with evidence. I knew what we were doing was wrong, she told Detective Santos. But Chief Morrison made it clear that cooperation was expected, and that non-cooperation would result in job termination and potential retaliation. Ms. Rodriguez, what specific services did you provide to Chief Morrison? I identified buildings that were prime candidates for insurance fires, structures with high insurance coverage, minimal historical value, and current safety violations that made fires appear accidental. How many buildings did you evaluate for Morrison's program? Approximately 40 buildings over 8 years. Morrison selected 17 for actual fires based on my assessments and other factors. Rodriguez had maintained detailed records of her activities, apparently as insurance against potential prosecution. Her files provided a comprehensive picture of how Morrison's team had systematically identified and prepared target buildings. Ms. Rodriguez, did you participate in preparing buildings for arson? I provided information about structural weaknesses, utility locations, and materials that would burn quickly. I also ensured that fire safety systems in target buildings were reported as non-functional prior to fires. Were the safety systems actually non-functional? Rodriguez's voice dropped to a whisper. Sometimes they were disabled as part of pre-fire preparation. Morrison said this was necessary to ensure complete structure removal and maximize insurance recovery. Detective Santos realized that Rodriguez had been directly involved in creating conditions that would ensure firefighters entering target buildings would face maximum danger. Ms. Rodriguez, did you know that disabling safety systems would put firefighters at risk? Yes, but Morrison assured me that only experienced firefighters would be assigned to these fires and that proper safety protocols would be followed. Except that Thomas Walsh was sent into the Gratiot Avenue building alone, with disabled safety systems and strategically placed accelerants. Atutur, Rodriguez began crying. I didn't know Morrison was planning to hurt Walsh. I thought the fires were being conducted as controlled training exercises with appropriate safety measures. The final major arrest was City Attorney Michael Park, brother of Fire Inspector David Park, who had already confessed to his role in the conspiracy. Michael Park had provided legal cover for the scheme by drafting contracts and agreements that disguised criminal payments as legitimate consulting fees. Michael Park was 61 and had served as city attorney from 1985 to 1998. His involvement in Morrison's conspiracy represented the highest level of municipal government corruption, as the city attorney was responsible for ensuring that city operations complied with legal requirements. Mr. Park, Detective Santos said during his initial interview, your brother David has confessed to participating in Chief Morrison's insurance fraud scheme. We have evidence that you provided legal services to facilitate that scheme. Park had arrived with prominent criminal defense attorney Sarah Mitchell, suggesting that he had been expecting arrest and had prepared for legal proceedings. "Detective," Park replied, "I provided routine legal services to the Fire Department and Urban Development Department as part of my official duties. If those services were used in ways I didn't intend or authorize, I cannot be held responsible for others' criminal activities." Detective Santos placed a stack of documents on the table. "Mr. Park, these are contracts you drafted for Morrison Properties between 1987 and 1995. The contracts describe consulting fees and service agreements that total more than $400,000. These payments corresponded exactly with insurance payouts from fires at Morrison Properties buildings." Park examined the documents carefully. "These appear to be legitimate consulting agreements for urban development and fire safety services. Mr. Park, the consulting fees were payments for arson and insurance fraud. The services described in your contracts include accelerated demolition, expedited site preparation, and coordinated emergency response. These are code phrases for deliberate arson." Park's attorney requested a private consultation, and the interview was suspended for 30 minutes. When they returned, Park's demeanor had changed significantly. "Detective," Park said, "I'm prepared to acknowledge that some of the legal work I performed may have been used to facilitate activities I didn't fully understand at the time. Mr. Park, did you know that the consulting agreements you drafted were disguising payments for criminal services? I knew that the agreements involved urban development activities that were outside normal municipal procedures." Chief Morrison explained that innovative approaches were necessary to address Detroit's abandoned building crisis. "When did you realize that Morrison was committing crimes?" Park was quiet for several long moments. "In 1990, Morrison asked me to draft an agreement that would provide legal immunity for city officials involved in emergency urban development activities. When I asked why such immunity would be necessary, Morrison said that some aspects of the program might be misunderstood by federal investigators." "What did you conclude from that conversation?" "I concluded that Morrison was engaged in activities that could be viewed as illegal, but that those activities were intended to benefit the city and its residents." Detective Santos could see that Park, like the other participants, had rationalized his involvement by focusing on purported public benefits rather than criminal methods. "Mr. Park, Thomas Walsh was investigating Morrison's activities in October 1990. Did Morrison discuss Walsh's investigation with you?" "Morrison mentioned that a firefighter was asking questions that could jeopardize ongoing urban development projects. Morrison said that Walsh's concerns were being addressed through proper department channels." "Shay, did Morrison ask you to provide legal advice about how to handle Walsh's investigation?" Park looked at his attorney before answering. "Morrison asked me about potential legal exposure if federal investigators became involved. I advised him that cooperation with any investigation would be the appropriate response. But Morrison chose a different approach. Morrison told me that Walsh had been reassigned and that his concerns about department protocols were no longer an issue. Mr. Park, did you know that Morrison was planning to kill Thomas Walsh?" "Absolutely not. If I had known Morrison was planning violence against anyone, I would have immediately contacted law enforcement." Detective Santos concluded the interview with a clear understanding that all of Morrison's co-conspirators had chosen varying degrees of willful ignorance about the criminal nature of their activities. While they had all profited from the insurance fraud scheme, most had avoided direct knowledge of Morrison's plan to murder Thomas Walsh. The prosecutions would proceed based on evidence of conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The surviving participants would face significant prison sentences, but the mastermind of the operation had escaped justice through death. As Detective Santos prepared her final reports, she reflected on the scope of corruption that Thomas Walsh had uncovered. A fire chief had used his position to orchestrate systematic arson, involving multiple city departments and generating millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims. The conspiracy had operated for nearly a decade, destroying dozens of buildings and corrupting numerous public officials. But the human cost remained the most tragic aspect of the case. Thomas Walsh had sacrificed 17 years with his family to protect them from Chief Morrison's threats. Patricia Walsh had raised 2 children alone, believing her husband was dead. The children had grown up without their father because public officials had chosen personal profit over public service and human decency. Justice would finally be served, but it had come 17 years too late for the Walsh family. Justice and resolution. 6 months after Detective Santos had first entered the abandoned warehouse with Jake Morrison, the courtroom in Detroit's Frank Murphy Hall of Justice was packed with spectators, media, and family members waiting to hear the final verdicts in People vs. Chen, Rodriguez, and Park. The three surviving major conspirators in Chief Morrison's insurance fraud scheme had been tried together in a case that had dominated Detroit news coverage for months. Judge Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran of the bench known for her thoroughness in complex cases, had presided over 6 weeks of testimony that had exposed the full scope of municipal corruption in 1990s Detroit. Thomas Walsh's documentation, Harold Brennan's confession, and testimony from Frank Rodriguez and David Park had provided overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal activity. Detective Santos sat in the gallery next to Patricia Walsh, who had attended every day of the trial. Patricia was now 55, her brown hair completely gray, but her posture remained straight and her attention focused. Her children, Michael and Sarah, now 34 and 31 respectively, sat beside her. They had finally learned the truth about their father's disappearance and were witnessing the accountability he had died trying to achieve. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Williams asked. Jury foreman David Chen, no relation to defendant Robert Chen, stood and handed the verdict forms to the court clerk. Yes, Your Honor. The reading of the verdicts took nearly 10 minutes due to the multiple charges against each defendant. Robert Chen, the former deputy mayor, was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit arson, insurance fraud, racketeering, and accessory to attempted murder. Lisa Rodriguez, the building inspector, was found guilty on all counts except accessory to attempted murder. The jury had accepted her testimony that she hadn't known about Morrison's plan to kill Thomas Walsh. Michael Park, the former city attorney, was found guilty of conspiracy and fraud charges, but not racketeering or attempted murder. Judge Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, but legal experts predicted that Chen would receive 15 to 20 years in prison, Rodriguez would receive 8 to 12 years, and Park would receive 5 to 8 years. Harold Brennan, who had cooperated fully with prosecutors, would likely receive a reduced sentence of 3 to 5 years. David Park, the former fire inspector who had been the first to confess, had already been sentenced to 4 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 years. Frank Rodriguez had received immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony, though he would face departmental disciplinary action and loss of pension benefits. As the courtroom emptied, Detective Santos approached Patricia Walsh and her children. Mrs. Walsh, I know this has been a difficult process, but your husband's sacrifice has finally resulted in justice. Patricia nodded, tears in her eyes. Detective, I'm grateful that the truth has been exposed. But I keep thinking about all the years Tom could have had with us if he hadn't been forced into hiding. Michael Walsh, who now worked as a paramedic in Detroit, had spent months learning about his father's heroic efforts to expose corruption. Detective Santos, my father could have ignored what he discovered. He could have kept quiet and remained safe with his family. Instead, he risked everything to do what was right. Sarah Walsh, a teacher in the Detroit public school system, had struggled with anger over the years her father had missed. I understand why Dad stayed away. He was protecting us, but I wish there had been another way. Detective Santos had thought about this question many times during the investigation. Your father faced an impossible choice. Chief Morrison had made it clear that coming forward would endanger your lives. Tom chose to sacrifice his own happiness to ensure your safety. The impact of the case extended far beyond the Walsh family. The Detroit Fire Department had implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future corruption. The city had established an independent inspector general's office to monitor municipal operations. Insurance companies had strengthened their claims investigation procedures to identify fraudulent patterns. Jake Morrison had been profoundly affected by learning about his father's criminal activities. Despite the public attention and family embarrassment, Jake had chosen to speak publicly about the case. emphasizing that his father's crimes didn't represent the values of honest firefighters and public servants. "My father betrayed the trust that citizens place in their public officials," Jake had told reporters. "The men and women who serve honestly in the Detroit Fire Department shouldn't be judged by my father's actions. Tom Walsh represents the integrity and courage that should define public service." 2 weeks after the verdicts, Detective Santos attended a ceremony at Detroit Fire Department headquarters where Thomas Walsh was posthumously awarded the Medal of Valor, the department's highest honor. Chief Maria Rodriguez, no relation to Lisa Rodriguez, the convicted building inspector, presented the medal to Patricia Walsh in front of an audience of firefighters, city officials, and community members. Thomas Walsh embodied the courage and integrity that define the finest traditions of the fire service, Chief Rodriguez said. He chose personal sacrifice over personal safety, protecting both his family and his fellow firefighters from criminal exploitation. His 17-year vigil in the shadows of our city demonstrates a level of dedication that inspires all who serve. Patricia Walsh accepted the medal with dignity, though her voice broke as she addressed the audience. Tom would be honored to receive this recognition, but he would want everyone to remember that he was just doing his job. He saw something wrong, and he tried to fix it. That's what public servants are supposed to do. The ceremony concluded with the dedication of a memorial garden outside Fire Station 47, where Thomas Walsh had been assigned. A bronze plaque read, "In memory of Thomas Walsh, Detroit Fire Department, who gave his life in service to truth and justice. His sacrifice protected his family and his community from those who would corrupt the sacred trust of public service." Detective Santos had been invited to speak at the ceremony, and she used the opportunity to reflect on the broader lessons of the case. Thomas Walsh's story reminds us that individual courage can triumph over institutional corruption, but only if we're willing to support those who speak truth to power. Tom Walsh couldn't fight this battle alone. It took 17 years and the efforts of many people to bring his story to light and achieve justice. In the months that followed, Detroit experienced what local media called the Walsh effect, increased public attention to municipal accountability, and a wave of reforms designed to prevent future corruption. The City Council passed new ordinances requiring independent oversight of major insurance claims involving city property. The fire department implemented peer review procedures to identify unusual response patterns. The planning department established transparent processes for building assessment and demolition scheduling. Patricia Walsh used some of the city's settlement money. Detroit had paid $2.3 million to resolve civil claims related to the conspiracy, to establish the Thomas Walsh Foundation for Public Service Integrity. The foundation provided scholarships for students pursuing careers in public service and funded training programs for government employees on ethical decision-making. 1 year after the warehouse discovery, Detective Santos received a call from the Thomas Walsh Foundation requesting her participation in a documentary about the case. The documentary, titled 17 Years in the Shadows, would tell the complete story of Thomas Walsh's sacrifice and its impact on Detroit. During the filming, Detective Santos was asked to reflect on the personal cost of corruption. The Walsh case shows us that criminal activity by public officials doesn't just steal money or damage institutions, she said. It destroys families, separates parents from children, and forces good people to make impossible choices. Thomas Walsh lost 17 years with his family because corrupt officials valued personal profit over human decency. The documentary premiered at the Detroit Institute of Arts on October 15, 2008, the 18th anniversary of Thomas Walsh's disappearance. Patricia Walsh attended with her children and grandchildren, including 2 grandsons who had been born after their grandfather's death, but who carried his name and legacy. As Detective Santos watched the film, she was struck by archival footage of Thomas Walsh from his early days with the Detroit Fire Department. He had been a young man with a bright smile and obvious dedication to his profession. The tragedy wasn't just that he had been forced to disappear. It was that his disappearance had been necessary to protect the very people he loved most. The case had taught Detective Santos that justice is sometimes delayed but never truly denied. Thomas Walsh's 17-year vigil in Detroit's abandoned buildings had finally ended with accountability for those who had forced him into exile. The corrupt officials who had profited from his silence were now in prison. The family he had protected from a distance was finally free to honor his memory publicly. But Detective Santos knew that the ultimate victory belonged to Thomas Walsh himself. He had faced an impossible choice between personal happiness and family safety, and he had chosen his family. He had discovered a criminal conspiracy and spent 17 years documenting evidence that would eventually bring the perpetrators to justice. He had lived in poverty and isolation so that his wife and children could live in safety and security. In the end, Thomas Walsh had won. His integrity had triumphed over Chief Morrison's corruption. His love for his family had outlasted the threats against them. His commitment to justice had survived 17 years of exile and had finally achieved the accountability he had died seeking. The warehouse discovery that had started with Carpenter Jake Morrison finding old firefighter gear had concluded with the exposure of municipal corruption, the imprisonment of criminal conspirators, and the recognition of a hero who had sacrificed everything for truth and justice. Thomas Walsh's story had finally been told, and his legacy would inspire future generations of public servants to choose courage over compromise, integrity over personal gain, and justice over silence. Detective Santos closed her file on the Walsh case, knowing that she had been privileged to help tell one of Detroit's most important stories. The story of an ordinary man who had done extraordinary things to protect his family and serve his community. Thomas Walsh's 17 years in the shadows had ended with his emergence into the light of justice and the honor he had always deserved. Epilogue. 5 years later. In 2012, Patricia Walsh remarried Robert Mitchell, the retired fire captain who had supervised her husband's unit and had never stopped believing that Thomas was a hero. They live quietly in Dearborn, where Patricia continues to manage the Thomas Walsh Foundation. Michael Walsh became Detroit Fire Department's deputy chief in 2011, serving with the same integrity his father had demonstrated. Sarah Walsh was elected to Detroit City Council in 2013, running on a platform of municipal accountability and transparent government. Jake Morrison's construction company was awarded the contract to renovate the warehouse at 1247 Gratiot Avenue into affordable housing units. A plaque in the lobby honors Thomas Walsh's memory and tells the story of his discovery of corruption within city government. Detective Santos was promoted to lieutenant in 2010 and now supervises the Detroit Police Department's Public Corruption Unit. The unit uses Thomas Walsh's investigative methods as a training model for officers learning to identify and document systematic criminal activity. The Thomas Walsh Memorial Garden at Fire Station 47 has become a pilgrimage site for firefighters from across the country who come to honor a colleague who chose duty over safety and justice over silence. Chief Morrison's name was removed from all Detroit Fire Department facilities and honors. His legacy serves as a cautionary tale about how positions of public trust can be corrupted by personal greed. Thomas Walsh's story continues to inspire public servants who face ethical challenges in their daily work. His 17-year sacrifice demonstrates that individual integrity can ultimately triumph over institutional corruption, but only through courage, persistence, and the willingness to pay any price for truth. The abandoned warehouse where Jake Morrison first discovered Walsh's firefighter gear has been demolished. In its place stands a community center that provides services to Detroit families, a fitting tribute to a man who gave up his own family life to protect others. Thomas Walsh finally came home.